Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We start with Sparta, and before your brain goes straight to the movie, to the abs and the slow motion and the "this is Sparta" moment, I need you to know something. The real Sparta was stranger, darker, more fascinating, and in many ways more disturbing than any film has ever captured. The Spartans were not simply tough. They were the product of a social engineering project so comprehensive and so sustained that it transformed ordinary human beings into something that their contemporaries found simultaneously admirable and terrifying. And the process by which that transformation was accomplished was not heroic. It was brutal in ways that had nothing to do with battlefield glory and everything to do with what happens when a society decides that the individual exists solely to serve the collective and implements that decision with complete consistency. So if you are ready, let us find out what it actually meant to be a Spartan soldier. Starting from the beginning, which in Sparta meant starting from birth. If you are born in Sparta in the year 500 before our era, the first examination you face happens before you are a day old. Your father carries you to a place called the Leuctra, a meeting place of the elders of your tribe who examine you. They are not examining you with affection or curiosity. They are examining you with the specific question of whether you are fit to become a Spartan soldier. They are looking for signs of weakness, for deformity, for anything that suggests you will not be able to bear the physical demands of the life Sparta requires of its men. If they find you fit, your father takes you home. If they find you unfit, you are taken to a place called the Apothetae, which means the deposits, a chasm at the foot of Mount Agesilaus, and you are left there to die. This was not done with cruelty in the emotional sense. It was done with the cold efficiency of a society that had made a decision about what kind of human being it needed, and that did not allow sentiment to interfere with the implementation of that decision. The Spartans did not hate weak infants. They simply did not believe that the resources required to raise a weak infant to adulthood were well spent when that adult would not be able to contribute to the military capacity on which Spartan survival depended. The society that had made this decision had not made it arbitrarily. Sparta in the 7th century before our era was a city-state in the Peloponnese that had conquered the neighbouring region of Messenia and reduced its population to helot status, a form of collective serfdom in which the Messenians worked the land that had been theirs and delivered a fixed proportion of its product to their Spartan masters. The Helots outnumbered the Spartans by perhaps 7 to 1, possibly more. The fundamental strategic problem of Spartan society was how to maintain control over a population that vastly outnumbered you, that had historical memory of freedom and conquest, and that had every incentive to revolt if it believed that revolt had any chance of success. The answer Sparta developed was to make itself into the most formidable military force in the Greek world, so formidable that the prospect of Helot revolt against Spartan military power was effectively hopeless, and to sustain that military formidability generation after generation, which required that every male Spartan citizen be a soldier of exceptional quality from his earliest years to his death, which required a system of training and social organization that subordinated every other human interest, every other value, every other aspiration to the single goal of producing and maintaining military excellence. The Agoge, the Spartan educational and training system, was that system, and it began not at birth but at age 7, when boys were taken from their families and organized into groups called Ageli, herds, under the supervision of older boys and ultimately adult supervisors. The word Ageli, herds, is not incidental. It reflects a conception of the young male as a creature to be managed, directed, and conditioned, rather than as an individual with particular needs and particular development. At age 7 you left your family, not for a boarding school in the modern sense, with scheduled visits home and letters back and forth and the knowledge that the separation was temporary. You left for a system that would control every aspect of your existence for the next 13 years and that would reshape you so thoroughly that the person who entered at 7 and the person who emerged at 20 would share nothing except certain physical continuities. The transformation was the point. The first thing you learned in the Agoge was to be cold, not metaphorically, literally. Spartan boys slept on reed beds they cut themselves from the banks of the Eurotas River, without cushioning, without additional covering beyond the single thin cloak they were issued. In winter this meant sleeping in genuine cold on a hard surface with inadequate insulation. The purpose was not punishment, it was conditioning. A body that had learnt to function without warmth did not become incapacitated when warmth was unavailable on campaign. A mind that had learned to sleep despite physical discomfort did not collapse when a battle required endurance through uncomfortable conditions. The food provided was deliberately insufficient, not so insufficient that the boys starved, which would have defeated the purpose, but consistently less than enough. Hungry boys became resourceful boys. They learned to steal food from the communal kitchens and the surrounding farms to supplement their rations. Stealing was not punished if it was done cleverly enough not to be caught. Being caught was punished. The distinction was deliberate and revealing. Sparta was not trying to teach its boys honesty. It was trying to teach them stealth, resourcefulness, and the ability to execute a mission without detection. The moral framework of the Agoge was entirely instrumental. What mattered was whether the skill was developed. The conventional moral valuation of the skill was irrelevant. The physical training was comprehensive and sustained over the entire period of the Agoge. Running, wrestling, javelin throwing, discus, the full range of athletic competition that Greek culture valued, practiced not as recreation but as military preparation. The boys competed constantly against each other and against older boys in a system that identified and rewarded those who were physically superior and that provided social pressure on those who were not to close the gap. The peer pressure was not gentle. Boys who fell behind were subject to ridicule and ostracism from their ageli, that was itself a form of training, teaching them that failure had social consequences they would want to avoid. The deliberate inculcation of pain tolerance was systematic and ritualized. The most famous example was the annual flogging contest at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where Spartan boys were flogged until they bled while their families watched, and while they were expected to show no sign of pain. The boy who bore the flogging without crying out, without showing distress, without giving any indication that the pain was affecting him, was honoured. The boy who flinched or cried out was shamed. The practice was not sadism. It was a public test of the pain tolerance that was being developed through the Agoge, a performance of the stoicism that Sparta required of its soldiers in battle conditions. The psychological dimension of Agoge training was as important as the physical. Spartan boys were expected to be able to move at night, to forage in the dark, to navigate unfamiliar territory without light or guidance. The Crypteia, the secret society that older Spartan youths participated in, required them to spend periods living alone in the countryside, surviving without support, moving at night. The Crypteia is sometimes described as a coming-of-age ritual, and sometimes as a terror mechanism against the Helots, since the young men moving through the Spartan countryside at night were reported to kill any Helots they encountered. Both descriptions are probably partially accurate. The Crypteia served multiple purposes simultaneously, conditioning the young men physically and psychologically, establishing their ability to operate independently, and maintaining the atmosphere of terror that suppressed Helot resistance. The social structure of the Agoge was itself a form of training. The older boys were responsible for the behavior of the younger ones. An older boy whose younger charges misbehaved was punished along with them. This created a system of distributed supervision in which every boy had an incentive to monitor and correct the behavior of those in his care. It also created vertical bonds of loyalty and mentorship between older and younger members of the Ageli that were intended to produce the unit cohesion that made the Spartan phalanx so effective. The boys who trained together, who competed together, who survived the Agoge together, would eventually fight together. The training created the bonds that sustained the military unit under the extreme stress of battle. The literacy training in the Agoge was deliberately minimal. Sparta was not interested in producing philosophers or orators. It was interested in producing soldiers. Reading and writing were taught to the level required for basic military function. Rhetoric was taught not in the Athenian sense of elaborate persuasion, but in the Spartan sense of the brief, pointed statement that communicated a maximum of meaning in a minimum of words. The word laconic, meaning brief and direct in speech, comes from Laconia, the region of which Sparta was the capital. The Spartans were famous throughout the Greek world for their verbal economy. When Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, sent a threatening letter to Sparta warning that if he invaded Laconia he would destroy their farms, burn their villages, and kill their people, the Spartan response was a single word: if. The Spartans were not inarticulate. They were disciplined in their speech in the same way they were disciplined in everything else. Words were a resource to be used efficiently and precisely. The extended philosophical discourse that Athenian culture valued was a form of self-indulgence that Sparta regarded with something between contempt and suspicion. Talk was not action. The time spent talking was time not spent training. The man who could express what was needed in a single word was superior to the man who needed a paragraph, not because the single word was more eloquent, but because the economy of the expression demonstrated the kind of mental clarity and discipline that Sparta valued in every domain. At age 18, the Spartan boy graduated from the junior Agoge and entered a different phase of training that lasted until age 30. This period was still structured, still controlled, still oriented entirely toward military development. The young men lived in communal barracks, ate at communal mess halls called syssitia, and continued to train daily. They were permitted to marry at this stage, and Spartan law encouraged early marriage, but the married man did not live with his wife. He continued to live in the barracks and visited his wife in secret. This arrangement was both practical and ideological. Practical because it maintained the communal living that built unit cohesion. Ideological because it emphasized that the primary loyalty of the Spartan male was to his unit and ultimately to Sparta, not to his family. The marriage customs of Sparta were as unusual as everything else about Spartan society. A Spartan woman was not the submissive figure of Athenian social life. She was expected to be physically fit, intellectually capable, and psychologically strong, because she was the mother of the next generation of Spartan soldiers and the manager of a household in the frequent absence of her husband. Spartan girls received physical training that was unusual in the Greek world. They ran, they wrestled, they competed in athletics. The purpose was the same as the purpose of everything in Spartan social life. Strong women produced strong children. The breeding logic was explicit and unashamed. The famous Spartan sayings attributed to Spartan mothers illustrate the ideological expectations placed on Spartan women. A Spartan mother handing her son his shield as he left for battle is supposed to have said either with this or on this, meaning return victorious carrying the shield or return dead on it, since a shield abandoned on the battlefield was the mark of a coward who had thrown it away to run faster. Whether individual Spartan mothers actually said things like this, or whether these are constructed ideological representations of what Spartan mothers were supposed to say, is a question historians debate. What is not debatable is that these sayings represent the actual values Sparta expected its women to embody and transmit to their children. The Helote system that made all of this possible is the foundation without which nothing else about Sparta can be understood. The Spartans did not farm their own land. They did not perform their own crafts. They did not engage in trade. These activities were performed by the Helots, who were the permanent agricultural labour force of Laconia and Messenia, and by the Perioikoi, free non-citizen Greeks who lived in the surrounding towns and who performed the craftwork and trade that Sparta's economy required. The Spartan citizen was freed from economic production precisely so that he could devote himself entirely to military training and military service. This arrangement was economically efficient in the narrow sense that it concentrated the labour of producing soldiers in people who were not burdened with other economic functions. It was economically and socially precarious in the larger sense that it rested entirely on the continued subjugation of a population that vastly outnumbered the Spartans and that had every reason to seek its freedom. The annual declaration of war against the Helots that Sparta made at the beginning of each year, which gave Spartans the legal right to kill Helots without incurring the religious pollution associated with murder, was not a symbolic act. It was the legal framework for a system of terror designed to prevent the organization of Helot resistance by eliminating anyone who showed signs of leadership or initiative. The Helots did revolt, periodically. The Great Helot Revolt that followed the earthquake of 464 before our era was the most serious, requiring Sparta to request military assistance from Athens and other Greek states and lasting for years before it was suppressed. The awareness that revolt was always possible, that the numerical disparity between Spartans and Helots made suppression of a determined and well-organized revolt genuinely uncertain, was a constant source of anxiety in Spartan society that shaped every aspect of its military organization and social structure. At age 30, a Spartan male completed the formal structure of the Agoge and entered full citizenship. He was now a homoies, one of the equals, a member of the Spartan citizen body with the right to attend the assembly, to participate in the communal mess, and to exercise the full range of citizen rights. But the military service continued. Until age 60, a Spartan male was a soldier first. The equality that Spartan ideology proclaimed was the equality of shared military obligation, of shared physical hardship, of shared subordination to the collective will. It was not equality of outcome in any economic sense. Spartan citizens varied in wealth depending on the size of their allotted landholdings, but in the things that Sparta valued most, physical capacity and military service, they were expected to be equal. The phalanx that these men formed in battle was the practical expression of everything the Agoge had been building toward. The hoplite phalanx was a formation of heavy infantry standing shield to shield in close order, each man's shield protecting not only himself, but the man to his left. The formation was only as strong as its weakest link. A man who broke from the phalanx did not only endanger himself, he created a gap in the line that the enemy could exploit to destroy the entire formation. The training that had built cohesion, the ideology that had elevated collective over individual, the conditioning that had made physical discomfort tolerable, all of it converged in the phalanx where individual survival depended absolutely on collective discipline. The Spartan phalanx had a reputation throughout the Greek world that was not simply propaganda. At Thermopylae in 480 before our era, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas held a narrow mountain pass against a Persian army that ancient sources describe as numbering in the millions, and modern historians estimate at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 for 3 days until a Greek traitor showed the Persians a path around the pass. The 300 died to the last man rather than withdraw, knowing that withdrawal was impossible after the path around had been discovered, and that their resistance gave the Greek fleet time to organize the naval victory at Salamis that would eventually turn the Persian invasion. The deaths at Thermopylae were not suicides in the ordinary sense. They were the logical outcome of the Spartan value system applied to a specific military situation. Leonidas knew that the position was lost. He sent the allied Greek forces away to fight another day. He kept his 300 Spartans and a contingent of Thespians who also chose to stay because retreat for Spartans in that situation was not a viable option within the framework of values the Agoge had instilled. The shame of being the Spartan force that abandoned a position was not something that could be survived as a Spartan in Spartan society. The death in battle was preferable not because Spartans had a death wish, but because the social death of surviving through retreat was worse than the physical death of fighting to the end. The two Spartan survivors of Thermopylae, whose stories Herodotus tells, illustrate this point precisely. One had been sent away before the final battle on a medical mission and returned to find it over. He fought at Plataea the following year, and died there seeking the conspicuous death in battle that would redeem his survival of Thermopylae. The other had a disease of the eyes during the battle that left him unable to fight, and chose not to participate even though he could have died simply by standing in the line without seeing. He survived Thermopylae and returned to Sparta, where he was given the name Trembler and refused all social intercourse by his fellow citizens. He could not obtain a wife. No one would share a fire with him or give him a light. He died at Plataea also, fighting with conspicuous recklessness that Herodotus attributes to his desire to redeem himself. The fate of the Trembler is one of the clearest illustrations of how completely the Spartan value system dominated the lives of individual Spartans. A man who had done nothing cowardly, who had been genuinely incapacitated by illness during the battle, was nonetheless treated as a coward because he had survived when others died. The system had no mechanism for distinguishing between justified and unjustified survival. The fact of survival itself, in circumstances where others had died, was sufficient to trigger the social ostracism that made continued life in Sparta essentially impossible. The system was unjust by any standard that considered individual circumstances. It was also, from the perspective of what it was designed to do, extremely effective. No Spartan who had witnessed what happened to the Trembler would have any remaining doubt about whether survival through retreat was an acceptable outcome. The famous Spartan women who are supposed to have preferred dead sons to cowardly ones were not mythological constructions. They were the product of a society that had made a specific and conscious choice about what it valued, and had structured its entire social life to reinforce that valuation from birth to death. The Spartan mother who said she would rather her son die in battle than return having abandoned his shield was expressing a value that the Agoge had installed in her with the same thoroughness that it had installed it in her son. The system was self-perpetuating precisely because it shaped not only the soldiers but the women who would raise the next generation of soldiers, and the social environment that would reinforce the values in every interaction of daily life. Now let us talk about what Spartan daily life actually looked like for the adult soldier, because the Agoge is well documented and the ideal is well articulated, but the daily texture of existence in Sparta at the height of its power is something that requires more careful reconstruction. The Sycetia, the communal mess halls where Spartan men ate their meals, were the social centre of adult Spartan male life. Membership in a Sycetia was mandatory for full citizenship. A man who could not contribute his required monthly share of food to the mess lost his citizenship. This was not a trivial risk. Spartan land allotments varied in productivity, and a run of bad harvests could leave a citizen unable to make his contributions. The man who dropped out of the mess because he could not afford to maintain his membership descended to the status of the hypomiones, the inferiors, a category of degraded citizenship that was economically free but socially and militarily marginalized. The food at the Sycetia was famously bad. The black broth that was Sparta's most notorious contribution to Greek cuisine, a thick soup made from pork boiled with blood, salt, and vinegar, was described by a Sybarite, a citizen of the Greek city famous for its luxury, who tasted it and said that now he understood why the Spartans did not fear death. The Sybarite's remark is probably apocryphal, but it captures something real about the Spartan attitude toward food. Food was fuel, it was not pleasure. The communal meal was about shared identity and shared obligation, not about culinary enjoyment. The Spartan who complained about the quality of his food was demonstrating precisely the kind of attachment to personal comfort that the Agoge had been designed to eliminate. The conversation at the Sycetia was the primary venue for the verbal culture that Sparta valued. The laconic wit, the pointed remark, the devastating single sentence were practiced and performed in this setting. Military matters were discussed. Young men were evaluated by their elders. The values of Sparta were transmitted in the informal context of shared meals in ways that reinforced the formal transmission of the Agoge. The Sycetian was simultaneously a military unit, a social club, and a school of values, and it served all three functions simultaneously throughout the adult life of every Spartan citizen. The women of Sparta managed the estates that the men were too busy training and eating communally to manage themselves. The Spartan woman's authority over the domestic economy was real and substantial. She supervised the helots who worked the land. She made the economic decisions about the household. She raised the children until they were 7, and the boys entered the Agoge. The degree of economic and domestic autonomy that Spartan women exercised was remarkable by Greek standards. Aristotle, who was not a fan of Spartan women, complained that they controlled approximately 2/5 of the land of Laconia through inheritance and dowry arrangements, and that this female control of land was a source of Spartan weakness. Whether he was right about the weakness is debatable. That he was right about the phenomenon is probably accurate. The relationship between Spartan men and their wives, given that the men lived in barracks until age 30 and visited their wives in secret, was necessarily different from the domestic arrangements of other Greek cities. The Spartan man who was caught visiting his wife in daylight was subject to the ridicule of his messmates. The visits were supposed to be nocturnal and furtive, which had the ideological purpose of maintaining the fiction that the man's primary loyalty was to his unit rather than to his household, and the practical purpose of extending the period of physical separation that was supposed to maintain the physical fitness and emotional detachment of the Spartan soldier. The physical environment of Sparta itself was deliberately austere. The Spartans built no great temples, no magnificent public buildings, no monument to their own glory of the kind that Athens was constructing on the Acropolis at the height of Spartan power. The city that was simultaneously the most powerful military force in the Greek world had no walls. This was a deliberate statement. Spartan men were the walls of Sparta. The physical fortification that other cities built to protect themselves from military attack was unnecessary in Sparta, because Sparta's protection was its army, which required no walls because it had no equal. When a visitor reportedly asked where the walls of Sparta were, a Spartan supposedly gestured at the men training around them. The absence of walls also reflected a specific military doctrine. A city with walls can be besieged. A city without walls cannot be besieged in the conventional sense. The Spartan strategy was to maintain a military force so formidable that no enemy would choose to invade Laconia. If an enemy did invade, the Spartan response was not to defend behind walls, but to take the phalanx into the field and defeat the invader in open battle, which was the kind of engagement at which the Spartan phalanx excelled. The walls of other cities were simultaneously a defense and a limitation. Sparta chose neither. The Spartan king, of which there were always 2 simultaneously from 2 hereditary royal families, occupied an interesting and somewhat paradoxical position in Spartan society. In battle, the king commanded with something approaching absolute authority. In peacetime, the two kings were constrained by the board of ephors, 5 magistrates elected annually from the citizen body, who had the authority to bring criminal charges against the kings, and who exercised substantial oversight of royal power. The dual kingship itself was a check on monarchical authority. Two kings who could veto each other's decisions and who came from families with competing interests were less likely to accumulate the kind of personal power that could threaten the collective authority of the citizen body. The Spartan political system was a genuine hybrid that defied the simple categories of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy that Greek political theorists used. It had hereditary kings with military authority. It had a council of elders, the Gerousia, whose members served for life and who had substantial legislative authority. It had an assembly of all citizens that voted on major decisions, and it had the ephors with their oversight function. Each element checked the others in ways that prevented any single element from becoming dominant. The system was conservative, resistant to change, and remarkably stable. Sparta had the same basic constitutional arrangement for centuries, which was itself a source of Spartan pride, and a contrast with the constitutional instability of Athens, with its regular revolutions and counter-revolutions. The treatment of non-citizens in Sparta tells you something important about the nature of Spartan equality. The equality of the homoi was emphatically not extended to the helots, who were worked, controlled, terrorized, and occasionally massacred. It was not extended to the periokoi, the free non-citizen Greeks who performed the economic functions that Spartan ideology considered beneath citizens. It was not extended to women, who had substantial practical authority but no formal political rights. And it was not extended to the hypomiones, the degraded citizens who had lost their full status through poverty or cowardice or other failures. The Spartan equality was equality among a specific, narrow category of people who had passed the full course of the Agoge, and who continued to meet the requirements of citizenship. Everyone else existed in a different and lesser category. The decline of Sparta as a major power began not with a military defeat in the conventional sense, but with a demographic crisis that the Spartan social system was structurally unable to address. The Spartan citizen body was always small. At the height of Spartan power in the early 5th century, it may have numbered 8,000 or 9,000 full citizens. By the time of the Battle of Leuctra in 371 before our era, where the Spartan phalanx was decisively defeated by the Theban general Epaminondas using a new tactical formation, the citizen body had shrunk to perhaps 1,500. By the mid-4th century it was perhaps 1,000. The shrinkage was the result of several converging factors. Battle casualties among a citizen body that could not be replaced by the children of non-citizens. The economic polarization that pushed more and more citizens into the hypomiones category as land concentrated in fewer hands. The low birth rate that resulted from the social arrangements that kept men in barracks away from their wives during the prime reproductive years, and possibly the genetic narrowing that resulted from the rigorous culling of infant boys who did not meet the physical standards at birth. But we have only scratched the surface of what it meant to be a Spartan soldier. Because the Agoge was the beginning, the formation, the raw material being shaped. What came after, the actual life of the soldier who had survived the Agoge and entered the Phalanx and begun the decades of service that defined Spartan male existence, was a different kind of hardship entirely. Not the hardship of cold reeds and deliberate hunger and public flogging. The hardship of living inside a system that owned you completely, and that demanded from you not just your body and your labor, but your identity, your relationships, your inner life, your death. We left our Spartan at age 30, just graduated to full citizenship. He has spent 23 years inside the Agoge, from the examination at birth that passed him, through the cold winters sleeping on cut reeds, through the deliberate starvation that taught him to steal with sufficient skill not to be caught, through the public floggings at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where he learned to feel pain without showing it, through the Cryptea, where he moved at night, through the Laconian countryside, practicing skills that may or may not have included killing helots, who showed signs of leadership or initiative. He is now a homoios, one of the equals, and the first thing he does with his full citizenship is go back to the barracks. Because that is where he lives, for another 20 years, until he is 50, when the obligation to live communally finally relaxes, and he is permitted to take up residence in his own household with his wife and the children who have been growing up largely without a resident father. By the time he moves in with his family, he has been a distant figure in their lives for decades, present occasionally, absent systemically, defined in their experience primarily by his absence and by the ideology that justified it. The wife he married, probably in his early 20s, has been managing the estate without him. The helots who work the land, the decisions about what to plant and when, the economic choices about what to sell and what to keep, the raising of their children until the boys were 7 and entered the Agoge themselves, all of this has been her domain. She is not a person who has been waiting for her husband. She has been running a household with the competence that Spartan female education was specifically designed to produce. The reunion at 50 is between two people who have been living largely independent lives and who must now negotiate a domestic arrangement that neither of them has had practice in. This is one of the genuinely peculiar features of Spartan life that most accounts underemphasize. The Spartan soldier who has spent 30 years living communally with other men, whose primary emotional bonds have been with his messmates and his military unit, whose entire social life has been structured around male company and military values, is at 50 expected to take up domestic life with a woman he has known primarily through nocturnal visits. The adjustment must have been substantial in both directions, and the evidence from what we know of later Spartan social life, of the increasing power of women in Spartan households, of the economic control that Aristotle complained about, suggests that the men who moved into the household at 50 were frequently moving into a domestic world that had been established and organized by women who had been doing it alone for decades and who were not necessarily inclined to relinquish authority simply because a husband had arrived. The military reality of the Spartan phalanx in which these men served is worth examining in detail, because it is both different from the popular image and more interesting. The Spartan phalanx was not an unstoppable force that simply crushed everything in its path through superior physical conditioning. It was a tactical system that had specific strengths and specific vulnerabilities, that operated according to specific principles, and that required specific conditions to be fully effective. The phalanx in its classic form was a formation of heavy infantry, hoplites, standing in close order, typically 8 ranks deep, each man carrying a large round shield, the hoplon, and a long spear, the dory, with a short sword as a backup weapon. The shields were overlapping, each man's shield covering his own left side and the right side of the man to his left. This meant that a man who moved out of the formation not only exposed himself, but exposed the man to his right. The incentive to hold the line was not only ideological, but immediately and viscerally practical. Breaking the formation meant that the man next to you was suddenly vulnerable in ways he had not been before, which meant that the man to his right was also suddenly more exposed, which meant that the formation could unravel from a single gap with catastrophic speed. The fighting in a hoplite battle was intimate in a way that modern people, accustomed to warfare conducted at distances measured in hundreds of meters or kilometers, find difficult to fully imagine. When two phalanxes met, the collision was literally physical. The front ranks hit each other shield to shield with the accumulated momentum of two formations moving at a controlled trot. The impact was enormous. Men were knocked off their feet. The first priority of the front rank after the initial collision was to stay standing, because a man on the ground in a phalanx was a man being trampled by his own side as the formation pushed forward. After the initial collision came the othismos, the push, in which the entire weight of the formation was applied through the shields of the front rank against the shields of the opposing front rank. The men in the rear ranks were not standing idle. They were pushing against the backs of the men in front of them, adding their weight to the collective pressure that the formation was exerting. The battle was won by the side that could maintain formation cohesion under this pressure, while the other side's formation began to break apart. The physical demands of the othismos were extraordinary, pushing against the combined weight of an opposing phalanx while simultaneously trying not to be pushed back, while stabbing over the top of your shield with the spear at whatever part of the opposing fighter was accessible, while being stabbed at in return, while being pushed from behind by your own rear ranks, required a level of physical conditioning and psychological control that the Agoge had been specifically designed to develop. The man who panicked, who tried to step back, who broke the rhythm of the collective push, was not only failing himself, he was creating a dynamic that could destroy his formation. The Spartans were particularly effective in the othismos for several reasons. Their training had been more thorough and more sustained than that of any other Greek city-state. Their unit cohesion was stronger because the men of a Spartan mora, the basic military unit, had trained together for years, eaten together daily, slept in the same barracks, and formed the kind of bonds that make men willing to endure more than they would endure for strangers. And their psychological conditioning had specifically addressed the fear response that caused men to break formation. A Spartan who broke formation faced consequences that were arguably worse than death. A Spartan who held his position regardless of what was happening around him had been conditioned through years of training to understand that holding the position was the only acceptable response to whatever the situation was. The vulnerability of the phalanx was its flanks and its rear. A formation that was fixed in place by the physics of the othismos could not easily respond to threats from unexpected directions. If an enemy force managed to get around the end of the phalanx and attack from the side or behind, the rigid formation that made the phalanx powerful in frontal engagement became a liability. The commanders of the Agoge knew this. One of the reasons the Cryptia and the night movement training were so important was that they produced soldiers who could operate in ways that went beyond the phalanx, who could screen the flanks and deal with threats that the main formation could not address. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 before our era, where the Theban general Epaminondas defeated the Spartan phalanx and effectively ended Spartan military supremacy, was won precisely by exploiting the phalanx's vulnerability to unequal force distribution. The standard Greek phalanx formation distributed its men relatively evenly across the front. Epaminondas concentrated his best troops, the sacred band of Thebes, 50 pairs of lovers whose fighting effectiveness had been honed by the bond between them, in a deep formation of 50 ranks on one wing opposite the Spartan commanders who were on the Spartan right, as was customary. The deep Theban formation crushed the Spartan right with overwhelming local superiority, and killed Cleombrotus, the Spartan king, and most of the Spartan officers before the rest of the Spartan line could respond. 400 of the 700 full Spartan citizens at Leuctra died. 400 Spartan citizens dead in a single engagement when the total citizen body was perhaps 1,500. It was a blow from which Sparta never recovered. Not simply because of the numbers, though the numbers were devastating in a society that was already in demographic decline, but because it demonstrated that the phalanx, which had been the instrument of Spartan dominance, could be defeated, that Sparta was not invincible, that the aura of invincibility, which was itself one of Sparta's most important strategic assets, had been based on a combination of real military excellence and the psychological effect of that reputation, and that the psychological effect had now been shattered in a way that the real military excellence could not repair. The Spartan response to Leuctra was characteristic. They did not reform the Agoge. They did not change the Sycetia system. They did not attempt to increase the citizen body through the naturalization of helots or periakoi. They continued to be Sparta in a world that had discovered Sparta could be beaten, And the consequences of that continued self-definition were the continued decline that culminated in the eventual irrelevance of Sparta as a military power. But before we leave the battlefield, there is something about the experience of Spartan combat that deserves attention because it is almost entirely absent from the popular image. The Spartans went into battle with music, not the terrifying war drums that the popular imagination associates with ancient warfare. Music, specifically the elos, the double pipe flute played by pipers who marched with the formation and maintained the rhythm of the advance. The phalanx moved at the pace set by the pipers. The men in the formation took their steps together, maintained their dressing, kept their shields in the proper overlapping position, all to the rhythm of the music. The purpose of the music was not inspirational in the emotional sense, it was functional. In the noise and confusion of an advancing formation, with the clatter of equipment and the shouts of men and the general chaos of hundreds of people moving together, a rhythmic musical signal was the most effective way to maintain the coordination that the phalanx required. Men who could hear the rhythm could step together even when they could not see the men on either side of them clearly. The music was a coordination mechanism that served the same function as the commands in a modern military formation, except that it could be heard by everyone in the formation simultaneously and could be maintained continuously through the advance, rather than being restricted to the moments when the commanding officer chose to issue a verbal order. The Spartan advance to battle was also notable for being notably calm. Herodotus describes the Spartans before the Battle of Plataea in 479 combing their hair and exercising in the sight of the Persian army, which the Persians found deeply disconcerting. A Spartan who came from a culture where men combed their hair before battle was either supremely confident or supremely strange, and the Persians were not sure which. The answer is that it was neither exactly. The Spartans combed their hair before battle as part of a ritual preparation that was about performing the identity of the Spartan soldier in a moment of maximum stress. The ritual was a form of psychological grounding, a way of asserting through familiar physical actions that this moment was continuous with all the previous moments of training and preparation, and that the response to this moment was the same response that had been trained into the body and the mind for decades. The wounded Spartan was a complex figure in Spartan social life, because the wounds that were honourable and the wounds that were not were distinguished by a logic that expressed clearly what Sparta valued. A wound on the front of the body, on the chest or the face or the arms, was an honourable wound because it had been received facing the enemy. A wound on the back was a wound received while running away and was therefore shameful. The man who returned from battle with wounds on his back had some explaining to do. The explanation that he had been surrounded and attacked from behind, that he had maintained his position and been struck by enemies who had broken through the formation, might be accepted if sufficiently corroborated. The explanation that he had turned and run was not acceptable regardless of the military circumstances that had made running tactically rational. This framework for evaluating wounds was itself an instrument of military conditioning. A soldier who knew that returning with back wounds would require explanation was a soldier who was thinking about the social consequences of the direction he was facing when he received any wound that was going to bring him back from the field, still alive. The social consequences were not abstract future penalties. They were immediate, visible, publicly administered through the mechanism of social interaction that was the primary enforcement tool of Spartan culture. The man who returned with back wounds was going to face his messmates at the Sisycian that evening, and the day after, and every day after that, until either the explanation was accepted or the shame became a permanent feature of his social existence. The relationship between the Spartan soldier and his weapons deserves a moment of attention, because the weapons were not simply tools. They were identity objects in a way that is difficult to fully convey without understanding the complete context of Spartan values. The hoplon, the round shield, was the signature weapon of the hoplite soldier. It was large, heavy, and could not be carried in one hand for extended periods without fatigue. It was held on the left arm through a central armband, the porpax, with a grip at the rim, the antilabe. This arrangement meant that it could be strapped to the arm and held in position even when the arm itself was fatigued, which was one of its advantages in the extended push of the othismos. The hoplon could not easily be thrown away. Its weight and the way it was attached to the arm meant that abandoning it required a deliberate effort to remove it, which took time that a man in combat did not have. The Spartan mother's instruction to her son to return with the shield or on it, meaning return victorious with the shield or return dead being carried on it, was therefore also a comment on the physical reality that abandoning the shield required a deliberate choice. A man who ran away from battle and left his shield behind had not lost it accidentally. He had made a decision, however panicked and however understandable by any ordinary human standard, to prioritize his own survival over the social and military obligations that the shield represented. The spear was the primary offensive weapon of the hoplite, and the Spartan soldier's relationship to it was equally charged with symbolic meaning. A Spartan who broke his spear in combat and fought on with the stump or with the short sword was demonstrating exactly the kind of refusal to quit that the Agoge had been trying to produce for decades. A Spartan who dropped his spear and ran was demonstrating the opposite. The weapons were not simply implements. They were the physical expression of the values that the society had invested enormous resources in instilling, and their handling in the moment of combat was the most direct possible test of whether that investment had produced the intended result. The aftermath of battle for the surviving Spartan soldiers was governed by rituals that were as carefully prescribed as the rituals of the advance. The collection of the dead, the identification of those who had fallen, the decisions about burial were all handled according to procedures that reflected Spartan values in their treatment of the dead, with the same efficiency and the same subordination of sentiment to practicality that characterized every other aspect of Spartan military life. The dead were honored, but not with the elaborate mourning displays that other Greek societies practiced. The mourning period was short. The return to training and readiness was prompt. Excessive grief for the dead was considered a form of weakness that the living could not afford. The treatment of those who had shown exceptional valor in battle was itself carefully calibrated. Public recognition of individual military achievement was provided, but was not allowed to become so elevated as to create the kind of individual military reputation that could challenge the authority of the collective. The Spartan who was too individually celebrated, whose personal glory began to overshadow the collective achievement of the unit, was in danger of the kind of social correction that Sparta applied to anyone who stood too far above the community of equals. Equality in Sparta was enforced downward as well as upward. The man who was too visibly superior was as problematic as the man who was too visibly inferior. The relationship between the Spartan soldier and the helots he was simultaneously dependent on and responsible for suppressing is one of the most psychologically complex aspects of Spartan life, and one that the ancient sources handle with a degree of discomfort that suggests the Spartans themselves were aware of its complexity. The soldier who returned from training in the Crypteia, where he had spent time in the countryside operating with the kind of autonomous violence that the Crypteia was designed to develop, returned to a household where helots prepared his food, maintained his estate, and made possible the life of military training that defined his identity. The relationship was not one of simple contempt. There is evidence that individual helots formed genuine relationships with the Spartan families they served, that individual helots were trusted with significant responsibilities, that the personal bonds between specific Spartans and specific helots were sometimes real and durable. But these individual relationships existed within a collective structure that defined helots as a population to be controlled by terror, and that periodically demonstrated that control through organized violence. The Spartan soldier who had personal affection for a specific helot servant was the same Spartan soldier who participated in the system of collective helot suppression. The personal and the structural existed in tension that Spartan society managed by simply not acknowledging the tension. The Helots who fought alongside the Spartans in certain campaigns add another layer of complexity to this picture. In the later period of Spartan power, when the citizen body had shrunk to the point where it could not field armies of the size that strategic requirements demanded, Helots were used as military auxiliaries in ways that complicated the clean distinction between the military Spartan and the agricultural Helot. Helots who served in military campaigns could be promised freedom as a reward, which was one of the mechanisms by which the category of Neodamodeus, freed Helots, was created. But the existence of freed Helots did not change the fundamental status of the Helot population as a collective. Individual manumission was compatible with collective suppression, as Roman slavery also demonstrated. Now let us talk about something that the popular accounts of Sparta consistently underemphasize because it does not fit the simple narrative of Sparta as the city of warriors. Let us talk about Spartan religion, which was not the simple martial piety that the popular image suggests, but a complex and sometimes contradictory engagement with the divine that shaped Spartan behavior in ways that occasionally conflicted directly with the military values that were supposed to govern everything. The Spartans were by Greek standards extraordinarily pious. Not pious in the sense of being moralistic or concerned with personal virtue in a theological sense. Pious in the sense of taking the requirements of the gods with complete seriousness and refusing to violate them even when violation would have been militarily advantageous. This piety produced some of the most striking and most consequential decisions in Spartan military history. The Battle of Marathon in 490 before our era, when Athens faced the Persian invasion essentially alone, was supposed to have Spartan support. The Athenians sent a runner, the historical Phidippides, to Sparta to ask for military assistance. Sparta agreed in principle, but the Carnaia, a festival sacred to Apollo, was in progress, and Spartan law absolutely prohibited military campaigning during the Carnaia. The Spartans waited until the Carnaia was over and then sent their forces. By the time they arrived, the battle was over and Athens had won without them. The Spartans who came to the battlefield examined the dead Persians and agreed that the Athenians had done well. Then they went home. This episode is sometimes presented as Spartan unreliability or cowardice. It was neither. It was a direct expression of the principle that religious obligations superseded military ones. The Spartans who stayed home during the Carnaia were not afraid of the Persians. They had demonstrated at Thermopylae a decade later that they were not afraid of the Persians in any conventional sense. They were observing a religious requirement that their entire social framework told them was absolute. The god had laid down a rule. The rule was not subject to pragmatic exception, regardless of the military stakes. This was not irrationality. It was a different kind of rationality. One in which the divine order took precedence over the strategic situation. The Spartan religious establishment was extensive, and its requirements were detailed and regularly observed. The great festivals, the Carnaia, the Hyacinthia, the Gymnopaedia, structured the Spartan calendar in ways that created regular periods of religious obligation that competed directly with military availability. The Spartan army that was present at the Battle of Plataea in 479 arrived late because of the Carnaia. The Spartans who were supposed to help Athens against the Persians at Salamis were delayed by religious requirements. The pattern is consistent enough that it cannot be dismissed as coincidence or excuse. Sparta genuinely refused to compromise its religious obligations for military advantage in ways that occasionally cost it strategically. The gods the Spartans worshipped reflected the values of the society. Apollo was the primary Spartan deity, worshipped in his capacity as a god of order, of harmony, of the ideal human form. The Spartan emphasis on physical perfection, on the disciplined body as the highest expression of human potential, was connected to the Apollonian aesthetic of the perfect form. The young men who competed in the Gymnopaedia, the festival of naked youth, dancing and competing in athletic exercises before the entire citizen body, were enacting a religious celebration of the perfected human form that was simultaneously a military evaluation, a religious ceremony, and a social display. Castor and Polydeuces, the divine twins who were the patrons of Sparta in its military capacity, were invoked before battle in ways that connected the Spartan military enterprise to divine sanction. The two Spartan kings who led the army were understood as earthly reflections of the divine twins, each checking and balancing the other just as Castor and Polydeuces had shared their immortality between them. The political structure of the dual kingship had a divine justification that made it not simply a practical arrangement for preventing the concentration of power, but a reflection of a cosmological principle embedded in the divine order. The oracle at Delphi played an unusually important role in Spartan political life. Before any major military or political decision, Sparta consulted the oracle, not perfunctorily as a ritual formality, but as a genuine inquiry into divine will whose response was expected to be taken seriously and acted upon. The Pythia's pronouncements were sometimes ambiguous enough to be interpreted in multiple ways, which created a space for political maneuvering around the interpretation. But the framework of divine consultation was real, and the Spartan commitment to following the divine guidance even when it was inconvenient was genuine. This religious seriousness created a specific vulnerability in Spartan strategic decision-making that opponents occasionally exploited. A military commander who knew that the Spartans would not campaign during certain religious festivals could potentially time his operations to coincide with those festivals. Whether this was done deliberately by Sparta's opponents in specific historical cases is difficult to document, but the vulnerability was real and theoretically exploitable. The religious life of Spartan women was separate from but parallel to that of the men. Women conducted their own religious ceremonies, worshipped at shrines associated with female deities, and participated in festivals from which men were excluded. The sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, where the flogging contests were held, had a specifically female dimension in the original worship of the goddess that predated the later development of the flogging ritual. The Spartan religious world was gendered in ways that allocated specific divine relationships to men and specific ones to women, and the women's religious life gave them a domain of authority and significance that was separate from but equal in importance to the men's military religious observances. Now let us turn to the question of what Spartan old age looked like, because old age is the part of Spartan life that receives almost no attention in the popular accounts, and that is in some respects the most revealing window into what the Spartan system actually produced in human terms at the end of the process. The Spartan who survived to old age had survived the Agoge, survived 30 years in the barracks, survived however many military campaigns his service required, and emerged at 50 or 60 into a different kind of life. He lived with his family. He was no longer required to eat at the Sycian, though he could continue to attend. He was no longer required for active military service, though in the later period when the citizen body had shrunk alarmingly, older men were sometimes called back to service in emergencies. He was eligible to serve on the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, if he was 60 or over, and if he was elected by the citizen assembly. The Gerousia was in many ways the most powerful institution in Sparta. Its 30 members, including the two kings ex officio, served for life, and had the authority to initiate legislation, to refer matters to the assembly, and to exercise a veto over assembly decisions that violated fundamental Spartan law. The elders who sat on the Gerousia were the most experienced military and political figures in Sparta, men who had survived everything the system had thrown at them, and whose judgment was considered the closest thing available to reliable wisdom in a society that did not have a strong tradition of philosophical inquiry or theoretical political analysis. The election to the Gerousia was itself characteristic of Spartan decision-making. Candidates paraded before the assembly one at a time. Men were shut in a building nearby who could not see the assembly but could hear it. They recorded whose appearance generated the loudest response from the assembly. The candidate who had generated the most shouting was elected. This system was described by Aristotle as childish, and from the perspective of Athenian deliberative democracy it was, but it reflected a specifically Spartan understanding of political selection. The man who generated the most enthusiastic response from a crowd of his peers had demonstrated social capital that was the product of a lifetime of performance in exactly the domains that Sparta valued. The assembly was not evaluating the candidates on the basis of their position statements or their policy proposals. It was evaluating them on the basis of the accumulated social reality of their entire careers in the Spartan system. The Spartan elder was also the primary educator of the younger generation in the informal sense. The transmission of Spartan values that the Agoge handled formally was supplemented by the constant presence of older men in the social spaces, the sycetia, the gymnasia, the public areas of the city, where their behaviour, their speech, their manner served as models for younger men who were still in the process of being formed. The Spartan elder who combed his hair with the same care he had combed it before battle, who delivered the same laconic judgment in the Cicercian that he had delivered on campaign, who maintained the physical habits of a soldier even when he was no longer required to be one, was performing the continuity of Spartan values in a way that the Agoge alone could not accomplish. What the Spartan system produced at the end of this process, the man of 60 or 70 who had passed through everything Sparta required, was a specific kind of human being that existed nowhere else in the Greek world, and possibly nowhere else in history. A man whose identity was so thoroughly collective that the question of what he wanted as an individual, what he felt, what he preferred, had been rendered almost unanswerable by decades of training designed to subordinate exactly those questions to the demands of the community. A man who had been shaped with extraordinary thoroughness into a specific social function, and who, when that function was no longer operationally required, was left with the shape of the function and the absence of the function simultaneously. The Spartan veterans who appear in the historical record as old men are figures of considerable dignity and occasional poignancy. Their dignity comes from the genuine achievement of having navigated one of the most demanding social systems in history to its conclusion. Their poignancy comes from the evidence, in the stories that survive, of men who had devoted their entire lives to a set of values and a social order that was visibly declining around them in their old age, who could see that the thing they had served so completely was ending, and who had been so thoroughly formed by that thing that they had no other framework for understanding their situation. The old Spartan who watched the city's military power decline, who saw the citizen body shrink to a fraction of its former size, who knew that the phalanx that had defined Greek military reality for a century could now be defeated by a better tactical idea, was a man confronting the mortality of the institution that had given his individual life its meaning. The death of an institution is a different kind of death than the death of an individual. But for someone whose individual identity was as thoroughly collective as the Spartans, the difference may not have felt as large as it would for someone whose identity was more individual to begin with. And this perhaps is the final and most important thing to understand about what it meant to be a Spartan soldier. The Agoge did not simply train the body and condition the mind, it replaced the individual with the collective. Not completely, because human individuality is not so easily erased, but substantially. The man who emerged from the Spartan system at 30, at 50, at 60, was a man who understood himself primarily in terms of his membership in a community, rather than in terms of any personal qualities that were his own. His courage was Spartan courage, his endurance was Spartan endurance. His laconic wit was the wit of a Spartan, not the wit of a particular individual who happened to be Spartan. The identity was collective before it was individual. This made the Spartan soldier extraordinarily effective at doing the thing he had been made to do, and it made him, as a human being in the fullest sense, something less than complete. The Athenians who debated the nature of justice and the good life and the proper constitution of the ideal state, who wrote tragedies about the conflict between individual conscience and collective obligation, who built the Parthenon as an expression of human aspiration toward the divine, were doing things that Sparta had chosen not to do. Not because Spartans were incapable of these things, but because they had made a different choice about what human beings were for. The choice Sparta made produced the most effective military force the ancient world had yet seen, and one of the most philosophically impoverished cultures. The choice Athens made produced the most intellectually extraordinary culture the ancient world had yet seen, and a military force that was at best intermittently effective. History has remembered Athens more fully than Sparta, not because Athens was more successful in the narrow sense of military power, but because the things Athens chose to do left more behind them than the things Sparta chose to do. But the Spartan choice was a real choice made by real people with real reasons. The Helot problem was real. The military vulnerability of a small city-state surrounded by potentially hostile neighbours was real. The solution Sparta developed was extreme, comprehensive, and in its own terms effective for several centuries. That it was also a solution that required the sacrifice of enormous amounts of human potential to the specific function of military production does not mean it was irrational. It means it was a choice made with full understanding of what was being sacrificed and full commitment to the specific value that was being served. The Spartan soldier who went into battle at Thermopylae knowing he was not coming back had been prepared for exactly that moment by everything that had happened to him since he was 7 years old. The preparation was, by any measure, extraordinary, and the man who had been so prepared was, by any measure, extraordinary, and the system that had produced him was, by any measure, extraordinary. What it was not, what it could not be given the choices it had made, was enough. Enough to survive the demographic decline its own social arrangements produced. Enough to adapt when its tactical assumptions were demonstrated to be wrong at Leuctra. Enough to continue to be Sparta when the world had changed in ways that Sparta's values provided no framework for understanding. Sparta was a solution to a specific problem. When the problem changed, the solution did not. And that, in the end, was Sparta. The Spartan response to demographic decline was to double down on the values that had produced the crisis. The Agoge continued. The Sphacteria continued. The ideology of military virtue continued to be articulated with the same force even as the number of people it was being articulated to shrank inexorably. Sparta could not reform its way out of the demographic trap because the social arrangements that were producing the demographic trap were inseparable from the values and institutions that defined what Sparta was. To change those arrangements was to cease being Sparta, and Sparta chose, consistently and over generations, to remain Sparta at the cost of its military power, rather than to change in ways that might have preserved its military power but would have required it to become something else. There is something both admirable and tragic in that choice. The admirable part is the consistency, the refusal to compromise the values that defined the society, even when those values were producing outcomes that the society could see were destructive. The tragic part is the same thing. A society that cannot adapt because adaptation would require it to abandon its defining values is a society that is choosing a specific form of death over an uncertain form of continued life. Sparta chose consistently, and its choice was consequential. By the time Rome became the dominant power in the Mediterranean, Sparta was a curiosity, a tourist attraction for Romans who came to watch the flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia, and to observe the remnants of an institution that had once made the city the most feared military force in the known world. The Spartans who endured the Agoge, who slept on reeds in winter, and stole food to supplement their rations, and were flogged in public, and visited their wives in secret, and ate black broth in communal messes, and lived in barracks until they were 30, and remained soldiers until they were 60, were not simple people. They were people who had been shaped by one of the most comprehensive and sustained programs of human conditioning in history into a specific kind of human being that served a specific set of social purposes. The conditioning worked. The soldiers it produced were genuinely exceptional in their military capacity and their psychological resilience, and the system that produced them was genuinely extraordinary in its consistency and its comprehensiveness. But it was also a system that sacrificed everything that it could not measure in terms of military utility. The philosophy that Athens produced, the drama, the architecture, the political theory, the scientific inquiry, these were not available to Sparta because Sparta had made a different choice about what human beings were for. Athens asked what a human being could become. Sparta asked what a human being could endure. Both questions are real questions. The answers they produced were very different, and the civilization we have inherited is the product of both questions being asked, even if the Athenian answers have dominated the historical memory in ways that the Spartan answers have not. But there is more to the Spartan story than the soldier and the Agoge and the Phalanx and the decline, because Sparta did not exist in isolation. It existed in a world of other Greek city-states, of Persian empires, of shifting alliances and long wars and the complicated diplomatic reality of a Greek world that needed Sparta's military power and resented Sparta's methods simultaneously. And the Spartan soldier who navigated that external world was navigating something considerably more complex than the training and the barracks and the Sicilian had prepared him for. The Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 to 404 before our era, was the defining event of the classical Greek world. It was the war that Athens and Sparta fought against each other for a generation. The war that consumed the wealth and the men and the optimism of the two greatest city-states in Greece, and left both of them permanently diminished. The Spartan soldier who served in the Peloponnesian War experienced a kind of warfare that the Agoge had not fully prepared him for. Not because the Agoge had failed, but because the war itself evolved in ways that confounded the assumptions on which classical Greek warfare had been based. The Spartans were supreme on land, Athens was supreme at sea. The strategic situation that resulted from this asymmetry was one in which Sparta could invade Attica, devastate the Athenian countryside, and demonstrate its military dominance in every land engagement, but could not directly threaten the city of Athens, which was connected to its port at Piraeus by long walls that the Athenians had specifically constructed to make the city immune to land siege. Athens could raid the Spartan coastline, support revolts in Sparta's allied territories, and maintain its commercial and imperial connections through the sea, but could not defeat the Spartan phalanx in open land battle. The result was a war of attrition in which both sides could hurt the other, but neither could deliver the decisive blow that would end the war quickly. The Athenian strategy under Pericles was to avoid land battle, to bring the population of Attica inside the walls when the Spartans invaded, to watch the Spartans devastate the countryside from the safety of the walls, and to strike at Spartan vulnerabilities by sea while maintaining Athenian imperial connections that provided the financial resources to sustain the war indefinitely. The Spartan strategy was to invade Attica annually, demonstrate the impotence of Athenian land power, and wait for Athens to run out of patience or money or allies. The Spartan soldier who participated in the annual invasions of Attica saw a form of warfare that was psychologically strange by the standards of the Agoge. He marched through Athenian territory, burning crops and farmhouses and olive groves, demonstrating Spartan dominance over the land, and then marched home without having fought a decisive battle. The Athenians watched from their walls. the Spartans burned what they could reach. Nobody won anything except the slow accumulation of damage on the Athenian agricultural economy and the slow accumulation of frustration on the part of Athenians who watched their property being destroyed without being able to respond effectively. The psychological impact on Spartan soldiers of this kind of warfare is difficult to assess from the surviving sources, which are almost entirely Athenian in origin and perspective. But the logic of the Agoge suggests that the annual invasions of Attica, which involved marching, burning, and marching home without the climactic battle that the Spartan training was designed to produce, must have been a peculiar experience for men whose entire preparation had been oriented toward the decisive engagement of the Phalanx. The skills they had spent decades developing were not being used. The values they had been trained to express had no outlet in a form of warfare that was fundamentally about economic damage rather than military decision. The Battle of Sphacteria in 425 was the moment when the Peloponnesian War produced something that the Spartan system had declared impossible. 120 full Spartan citizens, trapped on an island by Athenian naval forces and subjected to continuous attack by Athenian light troops, who could hit them and withdraw before the heavy Spartan infantry could close with them, surrendered, walked out of their fortified position and gave themselves up to the Athenians rather than dying in place. The impact on the Greek world was immediate and profound. A Spartan who surrendered was, by every value the Agoge had instilled, a contradiction in terms. Spartans did not surrender. They died. The 300 at Thermopylae had demonstrated that. The values of the society were unambiguous on this point, and yet here were 120 full citizens, not peripheral figures but full homoioi, who had passed the complete Agoge, walking out of their position with their weapons. The explanation that circulated in the Greek world and that Thucydides records was that the Spartans at Sphacteria had decided that it was more useful to the city to survive and be returned in a prisoner exchange than to die in a militarily pointless last stand. Whether this is what the soldiers themselves believed or what Sparta told itself to explain the inexplicable is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the surrender happened, that it was understood throughout the Greek world as evidence that Spartans were not in fact invincible or immune to ordinary human calculations of survival, and that this understanding had strategic consequences. The Athenians held the Spartan prisoners from Sphacteria for years, using them as a deterrent against Spartan invasion of Attica. If the Spartans invaded, Athens threatened to kill the prisoners. The Spartans who had declared that Spartan mothers preferred dead sons to cowardly ones now found themselves effectively blackmailed by the existence of captured Spartan soldiers whose survival Sparta apparently valued enough to constrain its military strategy. The contradiction between the ideology and the behavior was visible, and the Greek world noticed it. The Spartan general Brasidas is one of the most interesting figures of the Peloponnesian War precisely because he represented a type of Spartan military leadership that the Agoge had not specifically been designed to produce, but that the circumstances of the war required. Brasidas was not simply a phalanx commander. He was a strategic and political leader who understood that the Peloponnesian War required not just military victory in land battles, but the detachment of Athens' subject allies from the Athenian Empire. He led a campaign in northern Greece that combined military operations with diplomacy, with the appeal to cities that wanted to leave the Athenian Empire, with the promise of liberation that was more politically sophisticated than the usual Spartan approach to allied relations. Brasidas was also unusually fair in his treatment of the cities he liberated, at least by the standards of 5th century Greek warfare. He did not plunder cities that submitted to him, he honoured the terms he negotiated. He built a personal reputation for trustworthiness that was unusual enough in a Spartan commander to be specifically noted by Thucydides. Whether his behaviour reflected genuine personal values or strategic calculation about the best way to detach Athens' allies from the empire is a question that the sources do not allow us to answer definitively. Probably both. But the fact that Brasidas was capable of both military and political sophistication suggests that the Agoge, for all its emphasis on collective conformity, did not entirely suppress the capacity for individual strategic thinking. Brasidas died at the Battle of Amphipolis in 422, which he won, in one of those ironies that military history regularly produces. The battle was also the occasion of the death of the Athenian general Cleon, who had been the primary political force behind the continuation of the war on the Athenian side. Both sides lost their most aggressive advocates of continued warfare in the same engagement, which contributed directly to the Peace of Nicias in 421 that temporarily ended the major combat operations. The peace was named for the Athenian general who negotiated it, rather than for any Spartan, which was itself revealing of where the political initiative in ending the war lay. The second phase of the war, which began with the Athenian expedition to Sicily in 415, was driven almost entirely by Athenian decisions and Athenian miscalculations, but its consequences were ultimately determined by Spartan strategy. The Athenian decision to send a massive expedition to Sicily to conquer Syracuse ended in the complete destruction of that expedition in 413, the loss of tens of thousands of Athenian soldiers and sailors, and the effective crippling of Athenian military and financial capacity. The Spartans, advised by the exiled Athenian general Alcibiades, who had been condemned in Athens and had fled to Sparta seeking safety and revenge, sent a Spartan officer to Syracuse who helped organize the Syracusan defense that destroyed the Athenian expedition. The final phase of the war was decided not by phalanx battles or by Agoge-trained warriors, but by Persian money. The Persians, who had been watching the Greeks exhaust themselves fighting each other with considerable strategic satisfaction, eventually decided that supporting Sparta against Athens served Persian interests better than continued Greek division. Persian financial support allowed Sparta to build the navy it needed to challenge Athenian maritime supremacy. The Spartan admiral Lysander, who was not a full Spartan citizen himself but a Mothax, a person of non-citizen parentage who had been raised alongside full citizens in the Agoge, used Persian money to build a fleet and used that fleet to defeat the Athenian navy at the Battle of Agoge in 405. He then blockaded Athens and starved it into surrender in 404. The victory was total, and its management was revealing. Sparta had won the Peloponnesian War. It was now the undisputed hegemon of the Greek world, and it had no idea what to do with the position. The Agoge had produced soldiers. It had not produced administrators or diplomats or the kind of political infrastructure required to manage an empire. The Spartan officials who were sent to govern the cities that had been liberated from Athenian control, the decaches imposed by Lysander, were almost uniformly brutal, corrupt, and politically incompetent. Cities that had supported Sparta against Athens because they wanted liberation from Athenian imperialism found themselves under Spartan control that was in many ways worse than what it had replaced. The goodwill that Brasidas had built in northern Greece through his unusually honourable conduct was squandered within a decade by the behaviour of the Spartan officials who followed him. The Spartan Empire, if it can even be called that, lasted a generation before it collapsed under the weight of its own administrative incompetence and the military defeat at Leuctra. The lesson is a hard one and a familiar one in military history. Military excellence is not the same as political competence. A society that is optimized entirely for the production of soldiers has not thereby optimized for the management of the complex political relationships that military victory creates. Sparta won the Peloponnesian War and had nothing useful to do with the victory because winning the war required capacities that the Agoge had not developed, and that the Spartan social system was not designed to develop. The Spartan who had been trained from birth to be a soldier, to hold the line in the otismus, to eat black broth in communal silence, to respond to any situation with a single decisive sentence, was not the person you wanted managing the political relationships of a complex interstate system. He was exactly the person you wanted in the front rank of the Phalanx when the formations met. The distance between those two requirements is the distance between what Sparta was and what the victory of the Peloponnesian War required Sparta to become. It was a distance Sparta could not cross. There is something worth sitting with in that failure. Not because it diminishes the achievement of the Spartan soldiers who won the war. Their achievement was genuine and extraordinary, but because it illustrates a principle that applies far beyond Sparta and far beyond the Greek world. Optimization for a single purpose, pursued with sufficient consistency and sufficient intensity, can produce extraordinary results in that single domain and leave an organization or a society completely unprepared for the requirements that success in that domain creates. The Spartan system was the most thorough optimization for military production that the ancient world produced. Its success in that optimization left it entirely without the capacities that military success required. The Spartan soldiers who marched to Leuctra in 371 knew that something was different, not because they were less well trained than their predecessors. The Agoge had continued, the Sphacteria had continued, the values had been maintained, but the numbers were wrong. 700 citizens where once there had been 8 or 9,000. The citizen body that had overwhelmed the Persian Empire in alliance with Athens was now a fraction of what it had been. The men who marched were trained to the same standard as Leonidas's 300. There just were not enough of them to sustain the losses that Epaminondas was about to inflict. The 400 Spartan citizens who died at Leuctra died fighting in exactly the way the Agoge had trained them to fight. They did not break. They did not surrender as the men at Sphacteria had surrendered. They held their formation against the concentrated weight of the Theban sacred band on the Spartan right until they were overwhelmed by numbers and by the tactical innovation of the deep formation that Epaminondas had placed against them. They died doing what they had been trained for 20 years to do, which was to stand their ground regardless of what was happening around them. And in dying they effectively ended Spartan military supremacy in the Greek world, not because 400 deaths out of 700 citizens is not a catastrophic loss, it was, but also because the defeat at Leuctra demonstrated that the Phalanx, Sparta's supreme weapon, and the instrument for which the Agoge had produced every soldier it had ever trained, could be defeated by a sufficiently creative tactical response. The invincibility was gone. The demographic capacity to replace the losses was gone. The combination meant that Sparta could not recover the position it had held before Leuctra. The Spartan response to the news of Leuctra is one of the most commented upon episodes in ancient history precisely because it was so specifically Spartan. The ephors who received the news of the defeat continued the festival that was in progress without interruption. They sent messages to the families of those who had fallen identifying who the dead were. They did not permit public mourning beyond the single day of official acknowledgement. The city continued its life with the same outward composure that the Agoge had been training into Spartans for 3 centuries. Whether this composure reflected genuine psychological achievement, or was a performance that concealed real grief and real panic, is something we cannot know from the sources. Probably it was both. The Spartan who had been trained for 20 years not to show pain at the flogging altar of Artemis Orthia had also been trained not to show grief at military catastrophe. The training was effective at both. What it concealed internally was, by design, invisible to outside observers, and probably not entirely visible to the trained person themselves. The mothers who received news that their sons had died at Leuctra, and who were not supposed to mourn publicly for more than a single day, were women who had told those sons to return with the shield or on it. The mothers who received news that their sons had survived were women who were supposed to be ambivalent about the survival of sons who had lived through a Spartan defeat. Whether individual Spartan women felt anything like ambivalence about their sons' survival is something that no source tells us, and that common humanity suggests was probably not how they actually experienced the news. But the performance of Spartan values in response to the news of Leuctra, the continued festival, the brief acknowledgement of the dead, the return to normal activity, was exactly the performance that the system required. There is one more figure in the Spartan story that deserves extended attention before we close. The figure of Agesilaus, the king of Sparta who ruled during the period from 399 to 360 before our era, who presided over both the height of Sparta's post-war power and its catastrophic decline, and who was himself a paradox that illuminates everything complicated about what Sparta was and what it was trying to be. Agesilaus was lame. His right leg was shorter than his left from birth, giving him a pronounced limp throughout his life. By the standards of the Apothetae, the examination of newborns that determined which infants were fit to be raised as Spartans, Agesilaus should have been left on the slopes of Taygetos. The fact that he was not, the fact that he passed the examination and was raised in the Agoge and became a Spartan citizen and eventually a Spartan king, tells you something important about how the system actually worked in practice as opposed to in theory. The examination of newborns was conducted by the elders of the tribe, who were making a judgment about the infant's likely fitness for military service based on their physical appearance in the first hours of life. The judgment was not always consistent. The political connections of the family, the reputation of the father, the general disposition of the elders conducting the examination on a specific day, all of these factors probably influenced decisions that were supposed to be made purely on the basis of physical fitness. An infant from a powerful royal family was probably evaluated with a different set of implicit criteria than an infant from an ordinary citizen family, not because the elders were deliberately corrupt, but because the social reality of who this infant was and who would be watching the decision inevitably influenced the decision. Agesilaus grew up in the Agoge with his physical limitation, presumably subjected to the same cold and hunger and flogging and physical training as every other Spartan boy, and compensated for his physical disadvantage through exceptional drive and exceptional social skill. The picture that emerges from Plutarch's biography of him is of a man who was personally courageous, physically more capable than his lameness suggested, charismatic in a specifically Spartan way, deeply attached to the friends he had made in the Agoge, and politically shrewd in ways that were not supposed to be necessary in a system where political decisions were supposed to be made by the assembly and the Gerousia and the ephors, rather than by individual political operators. Agesilaus loved Sparta with the completeness of a man who had been formed entirely by Sparta and who understood his own identity entirely in Spartan terms. He also had a clear enough view of Sparta's actual condition, of the demographic decline, of the political overextension that the victory in the Peloponnesian War had produced, to understand that the Sparta he loved was in serious trouble. His response to that trouble was not reform. It was more Sparta, more of the same values, more aggressive assertion of Spartan military power, more insistence on the primacy of the things that the Agoge had told him were primary. The campaigns he led in Asia Minor in the early years of his reign, going back to fight the Persians after the Persians had funded the Spartan victory in the Peloponnesian War, were militarily successful and politically catastrophic. The Persians responded by funding a coalition of Greek states against Sparta, the Corinthian War that forced Agesilaus to return from Asia to defend Sparta's position in Greece. The pattern was the same as the pattern after Leuctra, military success that created political problems that military success alone could not solve. And the response was always more military. Agesilaus lived long enough to see Leuctra and its aftermath, to see the end of Spartan military supremacy that he had spent his entire life defending and extending, to see the thing he had served with complete devotion begin its irreversible decline. He died in 360, at the age of 84 according to some sources, on his way back from a mercenary campaign in Egypt that he had undertaken in part to raise money for Sparta, which had become financially strained by the cost of maintaining its military position after the losses at Leuctra. The 84-year-old lame Spartan king, dying on the Egyptian coast on his way home from a mercenary campaign, is one of the more remarkable images in ancient history. The man who had been supposed to be left on the slopes of Taygetos as an unfit infant had outlived the Spartan supremacy he had served, had seen everything he valued about Sparta diminished, and had spent his last years doing whatever he could to sustain the institution that had made him. The devotion was complete. The tragedy was that the devotion could not change the fundamental dynamic that was ending Sparta's role as the dominant force in Greek politics. But here is what we need to understand about Agesilaus, and about every Spartan soldier we have examined in this long account of what it meant to live and fight in Sparta. The system that formed them was extreme. It was harsh in ways that we find difficult to justify by any modern standard of human welfare. It sacrificed individual development to collective function in ways that we would consider a violation of fundamental human rights. It maintained its power through the terror inflicted on a subject population whose suffering was real and enormous. It disposed of its unfit infants with a cold efficiency that we find, and should find, morally appalling. And the men it produced were, within the specific domain it was designed to produce them for, extraordinary. Not simply brave, though they were brave, not simply physically capable, though they were that, but possessed of a psychological coherence, a unity of identity and action, a capacity to endure and to continue and to hold the line literally and metaphorically. That was the product of the most comprehensive program of human formation that the ancient world produced. The Spartan soldier who stood at Thermopylae, and who did not move and who died, was doing exactly what he had been made to do. The making was extraordinary. The thing it made was extraordinary. And the cost of the making, to the individuals who went through it, to the helots who made it possible, to the Greek world that was both protected and dominated by its product, was also extraordinary. The history of Sparta is not a simple history of glory or of brutality. It is a history of a society that made a specific choice about what mattered most, and pursued that choice with a consistency and a thoroughness that has no parallel in the ancient world. The choice was real, its consequences were real, and the men who were shaped by it were real, with the full complexity of real human beings navigating an extraordinarily demanding system with the capacities and the limitations that human beings bring to every system they inhabit. They held the line, not just at Thermopylae, every day of the Agoge, every morning waking up cold on reed beds, every night returning to the barracks instead of to a home, every meal of black broth eaten in communal silence, every flogging endured without crying out, every campaign undertaken without complaint, every defeat absorbed without public mourning, every victory received without excessive celebration. They held the line, and the line held them, until it did not. And then Sparta was what it had always been in potential. A city that had chosen to be one thing completely, and that had succeeded in being that thing completely, and that found at the end that being one thing completely, however completely it was done, was not enough to survive a world that required many things. But there is one more dimension of the Spartan story that we have not yet examined, one that the military accounts and the political histories and the philosophical analyses all tend to skip past because it does not fit comfortably into any of the frameworks we use to discuss ancient societies. The interior life of the Spartan soldier, not the ideology, not the training, not the battles, but what it actually felt like as a human being with a human nervous system and human emotions and human needs for connection and meaning to live inside the most comprehensively managed social system the ancient world produced. We know what Sparta wanted its soldiers to feel. It wanted them to feel pride in collective identity, contempt for weakness, indifference to physical discomfort, loyalty to the unit above, loyalty to the self. The Agoge was specifically designed to produce these feelings through the mechanisms of conditioning that we have examined. Cold and hunger produce adaptability. Flogging without crying out produces pain tolerance. Theft rewarded when successful produces resourcefulness. The constant presence of peers who share the same experience produces unit cohesion. The values articulated by the elders at the secession produce ideological commitment. All of this was intentional and much of it was effective, but human beings are not machines. The conditioning that the Agoge applied was real and its effects were real, and the human material on which it operated was also real, with its own tendencies and needs and responses that the conditioning could shape but could not entirely eliminate. What survived inside the Spartan soldier underneath the conditioning is something we can only partially reconstruct from the fragments of evidence that survive. The friendships formed in the Agoge are one window into this interior life. The bonds between men who had been in the same Agesilaus from age 7, who had stolen food together and been flogged together, and navigated the Crypteia together, were by all accounts intense and durable in ways that were not simply the product of shared training. They were the bonds that form between people who have been through genuinely difficult experiences together, who have seen each other at their most vulnerable and most capable, who have accumulated years of shared reference and shared memory. The Spartan institution of the Aristes and Arimenes relationship, the bond between an older Spartan man and a younger one that combined mentorship with an erotic dimension, was not simply a feature of the Agoge. It was a recognized social institution that produced bonds of loyalty and affection that lasted beyond the formal mentorship period. The older man who had taken a younger man under his guidance in the Agoge continued to feel responsible for that younger man's development and reputation throughout his life. The younger man who had been guided by an older Spartan carried that relationship forward as one of the primary bonds of his social existence. These relationships were not secret. They were public, recognized, and valued as one of the mechanisms by which Spartan values were transmitted from one generation to the next, through personal relationships, rather than formal instruction. Whether these relationships involved the full range of physical intimacy, or were primarily emotional and mentorship in character, is a question that ancient sources debate and that modern scholars continue to disagree about. What is clear is that they were intense, that they involved genuine affection, and that they were understood as compatible with the Spartan value system rather than as a contradiction of it. The Spartan who loved his younger companion was not being unmilitary. He was expressing the kind of bond that the Agoge had specifically created conditions for, and that Sparta recognized as a source of military effectiveness rather than a distraction from it. The evidence from the battle of the Spartans with their lovers, which Plutarch describes as showing courage beyond what the ordinary military bond produced, reflects a broader Greek understanding that erotic bonds between soldiers intensified rather than weakened military effectiveness by adding to the purely military reason to hold the line, the personal reason of not showing weakness or fear before someone whose opinion mattered to you in the most intimate possible way. Sparta understood this and institutionalized it. The love that Spartan men formed for Sparta itself, for the city and the land and the institution that had shaped them, was something the ancient sources describe repeatedly, and that appears to have been genuine rather than simply performed. Agesilaus weeping when he was finally forced to withdraw from the territory he had been defending, The Spartan exiles who consistently tried to return home regardless of the political circumstances that had forced them out. The men of Sphacteria who surrendered and then had to live with the shame of that surrender in the city that had formed them and that they had failed to die for. These are not the responses of men who were indifferent to the place that had formed them. The Spartan soldier's relationship to his city was the relationship of a person to the thing that had made him. Everything he was, every capacity he had, every identity he possessed, was the product of Sparta's formation. To love Sparta was in some sense to love himself, or more precisely to love the only self that the Spartan system had allowed him to develop. The identity was so thoroughly collective that the individual and the institution were not fully separable in the way that they are separable for people formed in more individualistic social contexts. This is both the greatest achievement and the most profound limitation of the Spartan system. The achievement was the production of men who were genuinely willing to die for the collective, because the collective was genuinely inseparable from their sense of self. The limitation was that the collective was the only self they had. When the collective declined, when Sparta became less than it had been, the men formed by Sparta had nothing to fall back on, no independent individual identity that could provide meaning outside the context of Spartan greatness. The Spartan veteran watching Leuctra's consequences unfold was watching his own identity diminish along with Sparta's power. The capacity for joy that survived inside the Spartan soldier is visible in the fragments of evidence that remain from the festivals, from the music that accompanied Spartan religious life, from the athletic competitions that were themselves a form of celebration, as well as a form of training. The Gymnopaedia, the festival in which Spartan men danced naked in the midsummer heat of Laconia, was by all accounts a genuine festival, not a performance of joy, but an expression of it. The men who danced in the Gymnopaedia were celebrating something real, the fact of their physical capability, the beauty of the trained human form, the solidarity of the community that had produced them. The Spartan songs that accompanied military and festival life were another window into the interior. The war songs attributed to the poet Tyrtaeus, who may have been a historical figure or may be a construction of later tradition, but whose poems reflect Spartan values, with sufficient authenticity to be treated as evidence of what Sparta actually valued, articulate a philosophy of military courage that is at once ideological and genuinely felt. The man who dies in the front rank is beautiful. The man who runs away is ugly. The beauty and ugliness here are not simply moral categories. They are aesthetic ones, reflecting the specifically Spartan understanding that the highest form of beauty was the beauty of the appropriately functioning human being, and that the most appropriate function of the Spartan male was the courage that held the line. The Spartan music that accompanied the advance into battle, the aulos playing the rhythm of the Phalanx, was also by all accounts music that the soldiers found moving in a way that prepared them psychologically for what was coming. Not the rousing martial music of later traditions, not music designed to excite or to inflame, music designed to calm, to focus, to settle the mind into the state of controlled readiness that the Phalanx required. The men who advanced to battle listening to the aulos were men who had been listening to that kind of music their entire lives, in the festivals and the training and the religious ceremonies. The music was familiar in the deepest possible sense. It was the sound of Sparta. The fear that Spartan soldiers felt before battle is something that the ideology required them not to acknowledge, and that the training was designed to minimize, but that common sense and common humanity suggest was real. No human nervous system is immune to fear in the face of genuine mortal danger. What the Agoge produced was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function in the presence of fear, to continue doing what was required regardless of the physiological response that was simultaneously occurring. The Spartan who advanced into the Persian line at Plataea was not a man without fear. He was a man who had been trained for 20 years to act correctly in the presence of fear, and who had so thoroughly internalized the understanding that incorrect action in the presence of fear had consequences worse than death, that the choice between fear and action was not actually a difficult choice in the moment. The grief that Spartan soldiers felt for the deaths of their companions, which the ideology required them not to display beyond a single day of mourning, was real in the way that grief is always real when someone you have known since childhood, and fought beside for decades, dies in battle next to you. The performance of composure that Sparta required did not eliminate the grief. It required the grief to be contained, channeled into the continued performance of duty that was the highest Spartan expression of respect for the dead. The man who continued to train and eat and serve after his companion's death was honoring his companion in the specifically Spartan way by demonstrating that the death had not broken the system that both of them had served. Whether this Spartan way of processing grief was psychologically healthy by modern standards is a question that modern psychology would almost certainly answer in the negative. The suppression of grief, the requirement to perform composure while the actual emotional experience was not integrated but simply overridden by performance, creates the conditions for the kind of cumulative unprocessed loss that modern trauma theory associates with long-term psychological damage. The Spartan soldier who had accumulated decades of unprocessed losses, of companions dead in battle, and grief that had been overridden by the performance of duty, was probably not a psychologically healthy person in the modern therapeutic sense, but he was a functioning person in the Spartan sense. He continued to train, he continued to eat at the Sicilian, he continued to hold his position in the Phalanx, he continued to embody the values that the Agoge had installed. The system did not care whether he was psychologically healthy by standards it had no concept of. The system cared whether he continued to function as the system required, and he did, because the alternative to functioning was a form of social death that the system had made more frightening than the physical death that might result from functioning. The interior life of the Spartan soldier was ultimately an interior life shaped entirely by exterior requirements. The feelings that survived inside the conditioning were the feelings that the conditioning had not found it necessary or possible to eliminate entirely. Love for companions, pride in performance, grief for the dead expressed in the only ways the system permitted, joy in festival and competition and the physical experience of a body functioning at its highest capacity, fear managed into controlled action, love for the city that had made all of this possible and necessary simultaneously. It was a specific kind of interior life, narrow in some dimensions and intense in others, shaped by the most comprehensive program of human formation that the ancient world produced. It was also a genuinely human interior life, with the full range of human emotional experience compressed into the space that the Spartan system had left for it. The Spartan soldier was not a machine. He was a human being who had been shaped by a machine, and the shaping had left him with a specific kind of humanness that was different from the humanness of the Athenian philosopher, or the Mesopotamian merchant, or the Egyptian priest, but that was humanness nonetheless. And now it is late. Very late. The kind of late where the night has used up all its darkness and is beginning to think about giving it back to the morning. You have spent this night in Sparta, which is not a comfortable place to spend a night. You have been present at the Apothetae, where the unfit infants were left. You have been present in the cold barracks where 7-year-olds slept on reeds they had cut themselves. You have been present at the altar of Artemis Orthia where boys were flogged in public without being permitted to show pain. You have been present in the Phalanx where the formations met and the Othismos determined who would live. You have been present at Thermopylae and at Sphacteria and at Leuctra and at the Egyptian coast, where an 84-year-old lame Spartan king died far from home in the service of the city that had formed him. You have been present through all of it. And now it is time to let Sparta recede into the past where it belongs, into the history that contains it, into the complicated, impartial, and genuinely extraordinary account of what human beings have been capable of doing to themselves and to each other in the pursuit of values they held with complete conviction. The Spartans were not heroes in the simple sense that the popular image suggests. They were not villains in the simple sense that a focus on their treatment of the helots or their disposal of unfit infants might suggest. They were a society that had made a specific choice and pursued it with extraordinary consistency, and that had produced extraordinary results in the domain of that choice, and that had paid an extraordinary price for those results in every other domain of human experience. They were human, completely human, in the specific way that Sparta had made them human, which was also the specific way that Sparta had constrained their humanity. Both things are true simultaneously. The constraint was real, the humanity was real, the extraordinary achievement was real. The extraordinary cost was real, and they slept. In the barracks, on the reed beds, in the camps, on the campaigns, on the shields that carried the dead back from the battle. Under the stars of the Laconian plain that they had been born to defend, and had defended with everything the system had given them to defend it with, which was everything they had, which was everything they were. Sleep well. You have been in Sparta tonight. That is not nothing. That has never been nothing.